and thank you for joining us on this Skype. And our weather here is not too bad today. It's like 39 degrees and it's overcast as our wonderful winter skies take over. And so it's not too bad. At least it's closer to 40. And I can tolerate 40 pretty well. I'm going to start out today, and Bob will be joining in about some of these topics of interest, and one of them on 60 Minutes last week or this week, was it?
Last Sunday.
Last Sunday. They brought in a man who is Dutch, and his name is Boyan Slat. He was just a regular Dutch high school student when he went on a diving trip to Greece. Now, this was in 2011. Once underwater, said he was surrounded by plastic waste. He said there were more plastic bags than fish. So this was a few years back, and I imagine it's worse now. So what he did by himself was to come up with an idea of miles of big plastic pipes and pumping stations, and well, there weren't pumping stations, and nets that would, once the plastics were filtered, they would end up in these nets, and then they would be taken back to shore to be disposed of. We used to evidently give our plastics to China and they would do the recycling, but that isn't so anymore. They refused the plastics because they said they didn't want to be joined or known as a garbage dump. A lot of this plastic waste ends up on many shores. There isn't a pristine beach nowadays that does not have plastic waste coming in on the waves. It's a daily thing that has to be cleaned up. And there is, on this Brian Slat, this Dutch, he's 24 now, by the way. He had, let's see, where am I here? He said he takes most of his garbage. There's something in the oceans that is called a swirling vortex of garbage, which is the size of a continent, where plastic outnumbers the plankton. And you know, most plastic is made from oil. And there are ways that we can reduce our consumption of this plastic. And of course, I don't use any more straws that they pass out in restaurants, and use reusable produce bags. And one of the things that is amazing to me was to give up chewing gum. I'm sure we're all familiar with walking down the street with our mothers and stepping either in a big glob of bubble gum or chewing gum that somebody had spit out on the sidewalk. It's also underneath the tables. I remember being really little and sticking my hands under the table only to find the whole thing.
In a restaurant.
In a restaurant, yeah. To find the whole table underneath covered with gum. And I think I even looked at it one time. Wasn't too pleasant. We can skip the frozen food sections and buy fresh organic food. One thing, they said to use cloth diapers. I always used them with my kids because plastic diapers were not in vogue or even invented by the time my kids came along. So I had used cloth diapers. Anything that's packaged in glass is fine. So anyway, Bob, do you have any more to say about the plastic?
Well, when they showed this video on 60 Minutes, they showed that just tons and tons and tons and tons of plastic waste is created every day. And no matter where you live, you might live in Iowa in the United States, or whether you live on the coast, if you don't dispose of it properly, the plastic will eventually wind up in the oceans. And so they showed scenes from California where they had rivers that were just literally overflowing with plastic bottles and you name it. And then they showed shots from India and other countries where lakes and rivers were just filled to the brim with this waste plastic bottles and all sorts of different plastic, and it was just absolutely disgusting. And then they in this 60-minute documentary, they took the reporters to the island of Midway, which is famous for the Battle of Midway in World War II, and nobody lives there except for a couple people that maintain the place. And they said even their beaches are getting washed over by all sorts of plastics and bottles and everything. And on that island, they have a bunch of native birds.
Those are the albatross birds.
Yeah, the albatrosses.
And this is one of the main places that they breed.
It's the largest center of albatrosses in the world. And they say these albatrosses wind up eating the plastic debris, and it kills them.
Well, they showed a picture of the albatrosses that had died, and the feathers were gone, the skeleton was there, but what remained was the whole stomach was filled with different pieces of plastic, whether bottle caps, plastic bags, pieces of bottle. It was just pretty bad when it took up the whole stomach, and of course it kills the birds. And then it showed a mother bird feeding one of the chicks, and she actually, birds regurgitate their food for their young, and she regurgitated a plastic bag, and it went into the baby chick.
And they showed that all kinds of these albatrosses died every year from eating the plastics because they didn't know any better. And then they talked about the fish in the oceans. There are so many fish that die from eating the plastics, or they get trapped in plastic netting and all sorts of things. I mean, it was just so sad just to watch that. And it's a worldwide epidemic of it. So
they said even the trash and the plastic was floating over to Antarctica.
Yeah, the shores of Antarctica, there is no place in the world where the oceans flow that don't have plastic and these kind of debris washing up on the shores. It's just absolutely very sad, and it is so bad that you wonder if there's any way of saving it. Is there any remedy to all this? And I was telling Sandy this morning, I said, what they should do is they should take all those military aircraft that have the directed energy weapons on board that they use. If they can go up and down the California coastline and go over a house and literally disintegrate a house to where there's nothing left except for a few pieces of pebbles, and it's all dust. They turn all the matter into dust, just like they did in the World Trade Center when they used directed energy weapons. And I was telling Sandy, well, if they would use that directed energy weapon technology and take those aircraft and fly them over these rivers, they're flowing into the oceans, like in the United States, Canada, and over in especially in India, where you could actually walk across a lake just standing on the plastic. It's that thick. and they could go in there with those directed energy weapons and turn all that plastic into fine dust, so it would be like sand on the seashore. So that was one of my solutions. So if any of the government officials are listening to this conversation, that's an idea that they could use for good with those directed energy weapons. Instead of destroying good things, they could destroy the waste and maybe help the planet somewhat.
Well, one of the things, though, you have to be careful of is the flying fish lay their eggs on floating debris. They drop their eggs on it, and there are birds that eat the eggs, but they also eat the plastic now along with the eggs, rather than seaweed or some algae that floats on the top. So they'd have to find a way to gather the plastic before they did your idea.
Oh, that is so minute in comparison to the tons and tons. Another interesting thing that they showed in this 60 Minutes video was, as Sandy started to say, most people think that when you recycle all your plastic bottles and all that it's actually somehow or another gotten rid of. But all they do is they put it in a compressor that takes all that stuff and presses it into these big cubes.
Well, they're big bales.
Or big bales of plastic, and that's all they do with them. And then they ship off these bales, these 1-ton bales of plastic, and they used to send it to China, and China won't take it anymore. So believe it or not, all that plastic that they bale up from your recycling centers is being sent to third world countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, and a bunch of those type of countries, and they're taking it. I don't know if we're paying them to take it or how that works, but there's just they showed this one shot of a recycling yard, and the stacks of plastic were probably about the size of a Walmart shopping building, a super Walmart. Just one area of all that plastic. So remember, so just because we carefully recycle our plastic, it's still out there. And I was just thinking just now that maybe we could help the cause by not buying anything in plastic, like these bottles of pop and everything that come in a plastic bottle.
Water bottles.
Yeah, water bottles and all that. If you buy soda in a can, like an aluminum can, that's something they can melt down and recycle. That's no problem. But this plastic is just absolutely ungodly. So I think I'm going to change my habit in that respect, just at least for myself anyway. Hey there.
Okay. Well, I'm going to change the subject here, and I'm going to go to a couple of stories. I am terribly allergic to cats, horribly allergic. In fact, I went into anaphylactic shock a couple times because of them. I had never been around cats because my grandmother didn't like them, and I was brought up in her household. So I had no idea that they affected me that way. And I was over at my girlfriend's house in high school, and her white cat, this beautiful white cat, had kittens. She took me upstairs, and she had them in a dresser drawer. So I picked one up and nuzzled it to my face, only to find out that my eyes started watering first, and then my throat swelled shut. And thank goodness my girlfriend's father was a dentist, and he told me I had about 20 more minutes to live, and that would have been it. So he had epinephrine and whatnot in his case. So that was my introduction to cats. But I will say one time I had a very neat experience with them. And I was over at she belonged to the corporation, or was a member of the corporation. She probably still is. And she had one Siamese cat, and she had a Lhasa Apso. Anyway, the Siamese cat's name was QT, and I was to stay overnight there. And of course, I took some allergy pills, and she put me in a bedroom she didn't use. And so the cat generally didn't go in there. She couldn't remember QT going in there. So hopefully, I was thinking he didn't. So I went to sleep there, and I was woken up by this horrific pain in my gut area. I mean, it was getting worse by the minute. Now, my friend was an ER nurse, and I thought, should I get her up? Should I get her up? I was ready to go to the hospital. It was so bad. It was crippling. And I don't know how the bedroom door opened, but it opened. And in comes QT, and he jumps on my body, spread eagle. Within a few minutes, all the pain left. He jumped off my body and went out into the hall or wherever he goes that night. And I shut my door again, and I had no reaction to this cat at that time. So it was a neat happening. And I have another story. This isn't about a cat, it's about a bird. And I had torn my medial meniscus. And I was to be operated on in the day surgery place. And the day before I was to have the surgery, I thought, well, I think I'm just going to go buy a bird. So I went to the pet store, and I looked at all the different birds, and I fell in love with a pearl cockatiel. Now, this bird was about 5 weeks old. And he, or she, I should say, because it was a female, I bought her, and she came home with me. I got everything ready for a nice big cage, really big. And so I had my surgery the next day. It lasted quite a while. And I think it was supposed to last like 30 minutes. It lasted 3 hours because the cartilage was wrapped around the knee, and they had to get all the little pieces out. Well, anyway, my daughter picked me up. I came home, and I fell asleep on the couch. And when I woke up, I had my arm outstretched, and I had a little 5-week-old cockatiel sleeping in my hand. And she was so cute. I didn't want to disturb her. I don't know if I was breathing out excess anesthesia, which I could have been, or not, but the little bird was sound asleep in my hand, and it was so cute. Now, one thing I forgot to tell you, on my way home of purchasing the bird, I thought, now what am I going to call this bird? And out comes the word or the name Pepito. And it was like, I had never thought of a word like that, didn't even know that word. And the bird talked to me and said its name was Pepito. So that became her name, and she was really quite a character. I potty trained her in 2 weeks. So most of the times I left, unless I wasn't home, I left the cage door open and she could walk around the house. Well, one day I had laundry to do, and in those days I was ironing. So I didn't know where she went. I couldn't find her. I called her, Pepito, where are you? And finally I was getting kind of frantic, like, what happened to her? Is she caught somewhere? Did she get behind a dresser? I didn't know where she was. And after calling her umpteen times, this little bird comes out, and she bites my ankle, and she grumbles all the way back to my bedroom, like, and she climbs up my laundry basket where the dirty clothes were, and she went sound asleep. So that's a little story. But we can communicate with our pets, all kinds of animals. And they do things for us. We do things for them. It's a really unique relationship. And I've had many birds. I've always enjoyed them. I raised cockatiels at one time because I was rather enamored with them. But I just enjoy them. I enjoy the songbirds outside. One time when I was still living in Florida, it was very, very late at night. There were three of us gals playing music around the piano. And all of a sudden, one of the gals says to me, she goes, shh, shh, do you hear birds singing? And I go, yeah. So we opened the drapes, and there were two bushes that were filled with red cardinals, and they were singing. So that was another neat little experience there. And so we talked to them for a while and went back to our music, but it was a interesting experience. I had a couple visions. One of them, as I was doing the new UU, one of them was I saw the earth enclosed, well, not enclosed, but encircled with a huge, huge, heavy chain. And it was almost like a vice grip. And Dwayne, do you want to say anything about that?
Okay, yes. Yeah, we talked about that, and we were objectively seeing the consciousness of the world and how the world is trapped by it. Yeah. Yeah. That's basically it, and anything else you saw, yeah.
Yeah. I did have one other vision while I was doing the new UU, and I was shown an ancient jungle, like different trees and different animals, and very primitive. And I saw a monkey, and this monkey looked different than our monkeys look today. Of course, New World, old world monkeys, but this even looked different than that. I knew it was a monkey. It had a very big rounded head, and it had two triangular canines that came down, and it almost looked like two shark teeth, but not quite that big. So I sort of had the thought, well, is this the monkey that Enki used to do some recombinant genetics to introduce it to make the human? So I don't know if it was or not, but it was interesting to view it. Bob, you're on.
Are you finished?
Yeah, for now.
Well, I have a couple dreams I would like to share with everybody. And last Thursday, I had an interesting dream where I had just stepped outside and was hit with a misty substance. And I looked up, and there was a small one-man helicopter spraying something out at treetop level. And as I watched the helicopter, he made an emergency landing. And so we went over to find out, what was going on and why the pilot of the helicopter made an emergency landing. And we found that the pilot had been overcome by the toxic chemicals that he was spraying. And so we called 911 for him. So that was kind of an interesting dream I had. And then here's a dream I don't quite understand. Another dream I had, I was at a small airport, and I had the job of writing down the names of all the guests that came to this small airport fly-in. Any idea what that would be about, Dwayne?
Yeah, the people showing up. It's a small airport, right? So we don't have the big airport yet. So you're taking notes of the people that are flying in, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one is quite self-evident. Yeah, it's cause and effect, and again, it's a heads up. They're spraying everything, but at the same time, they're not seeing that they're affected by it too. So anything that goes up must come down.
I had another dream about this guy who had his own private B-52 that he flew in and out of a grass strip, and he kept it in an old barn. Then I woke up from that dream. I have no idea what that would be about. Any ideas?
Just someone else who wants to take over the world.
Yeah, I guess I could see that. I like in those James Bond movies when somebody wants to take over. Then I had another dream, and in this dream, I remember there was 4 distinct piles of mail, separate piles of mail. And then I woke up, and I had no idea what that was about.
Well, it's almost Christmas, so you're going to be one of Santa's helpers.
Okay. Well, anyway, I had another interesting dream where I was in a car and I was like near a stop sign. There was next to some buildings, in a little small town or something. And I happened to look up in the sky, and there was just a few clouds in the sky, but all of a sudden, some of the clouds became very dark, forming in the sky, and the sun was still shining, and these clouds just kind of, all of a sudden, these dark clouds formed in the sky, and in only moments, just a matter of seconds, a tornado formed, came down, and raced around on the ground, went around the building, and came racing right by where I was sitting in my car. It was within 10 feet of my car, and then went harmlessly off into the distance. I was totally unaffected by that. Well, it was a ferocious tornado, but it didn't do any harm to me. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, a Joni thought form.
Yeah.
She was trying to get you, but you're too tricky, Bob.
Interesting.